Hi, I'm Chip Rogers with AAHOA, and thank you for joining us for the AAHOA Educational Experience. This week we are talking about politics. I know it's not everyone's favorite subject, and some people get turned off about it, but everybody wants to hear about it, which is why we're going to talk about it this week. And joining me is Raj Goyal, who has had a distinguished political career, including serving as a state representative for 4 years in the Kansas House of Representatives and a former candidate for Congress, the Democratic nominee, in fact, for Congress.
That's right.
And Lori Kalani, Senior Counsel with Orrick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe. And Lori, you've probably seen this from every possible angle, and you've probably had more candidates than you could count from now until next Tuesday call and ask you for money.
Yeah, I have a lot of friends.
But, you know, it seems like we've talked about lobbying in previous shows. We've talked about the legislative process in previous shows. I want to talk about something I didn't have in my original notes, but the expense running a campaign in this country now, even to be one of 435 members of Congress, one out of 435 members of Congress. You ran in 2010.
I did.
And how much did that cost you?
I raised approximately $2.5 million, and there was more money on the other side spent against me and in the race, and so
you should be flattered by that.
Yeah, well, I should tell you that I couldn't agree more. The inflation in campaigns. I think a lot of political experts told me that maybe even just 4 years ago, that race would have cost half as much.
Right.
And so, a big cost driver in campaigns is the cost of television ads. As the marketplace has gotten more, as there are more and more media sources and people pay less and less attention, there's not just 3 networks anymore, the cost of acquiring the attention of the viewer has gotten higher. And so while there's many things that have happened in campaigns that have decreased the cost, such as email, and we of course saw that in the last presidential election, and the internet, which has transformed campaigning, at the end of the day you need to meet people, and if the district's large enough, you got to advertise on television. And so the cost of campaigns, I think, has gotten excessive, and I think people recognize that, the public recognizes that, and I think that's why there's now a search on behalf of both parties and a lot of people who know the system well for reform.
Yeah, you go back 150 years in our nation's history, and the president literally would not even go campaign. Right. I mean, he may stay in Washington, D.C. and speak over the radio or something, but he wasn't even out campaigning. And now we're on the verge of having a presidential campaign in which the president of the United States is estimated that he may raise $1 billion. And beyond just $1 billion, and I know that he was criticized in the last campaign over this, but when comparing Governor Palin and comparing President Obama's staff, when comparing what she ran in Alaska and what he ran just as his campaign staff, I mean, his campaign team may have actually been a bigger business, right. Just because it's so large now. And it's, did you ever dream of American politics? And that's the president, but it filters all the way down. Would ever get to this?
Oh, it filters down to the lowest levels. I mean, it's all relative, but I see it in the AG world. The attorneys general races now cost upwards of a couple $1 million in some states, and it's really it doesn't make a whole lot of sense to me, because like you said, we've got this social media world out there that is essentially free, aside from the cost of producing content possibly to go on the social media websites. It's free, and there's so much transparency that it's the driving cost of television and possibly newspaper ads, but you talk about Obama having a big campaign staff. I mean, most of those were volunteers, or at least a large percentage of them. So I'm always sort of scratching my head and saying, where do these large numbers come in, right? Are people just spending the wrong dollars? But I guess when you're out there and you're spending $2.5 million and your opponent's spending $3.5 million or whatever it is, you just keep spending. But I think it's a bit out of control.
Well, I can tell you, Chip, I've seen sort of both sides of this, because my first campaign in 2006, which I was successful, I knocked 8,000 doors. And boy, do I miss doing that. I've got a PhD in how to roll a flyer and put it in a storm door. Versus, I mean, I've seen all sorts of porches. I've been bitten by dogs, all that. But it was very healthy, because it not only did I lose weight in the process, but it was a great thing for democracy, and people were shocked They said, you're at my doorstep, you're not selling anything? I said, no, I'm here to register you to vote, sign you up for an advance ballot, and ask you for your vote for me. And I'll tell you why I'm running, and you can make your own judgment. And so, and that's because just the size of a state house district in Kansas, thankfully, is at the level where I could knock the entire district and do it in a meaningful way. But unfortunately, when you run for larger districts, I'm sure your district would be pretty impossible to knock, or you'd lose a heck of a lot of weight. Right. You have to advertise, and that gets very expensive.
Right.
But it's interesting you say that, because my first race, I did the exact same thing. I hit 8,000 doors. You do lose. I lost 21 pounds. And it was the middle of the summer. I was running in a primary. Yeah. But what I tell new candidates, and if we have any viewers who are thinking about running, number one, there is no better way to get a vote than to knock on somebody's door. There's absolutely no
good old-fashioned talking to people.
Right. All the studies show that. They say, the best way to get a vote. Yeah, absolutely.
And what I found, for me, and you probably, I suspect you'll agree with me, if you hit 8,000, it's actually the most enjoyable part of campaigning.
Absolutely.
You get scared of it, and then when you knock on that first door, you enjoy it.
Right. Yeah.
And because it's almost like you go to parties and you meet people and you talk to them. Well, you're doing that house after house after house, and wouldn't it be nice if we could get back to that in American politics?
Yeah.
Well, you learn the real issues, right?
Oh, you do, and you know what are on people's minds. And I think the other thing about it is that you just get a basic sense of how people live their lives, and you realize how little time they're spending on politics, and how little time they're worrying about, the latest and greatest from the state capitol. They're trying to pay their bills. They're trying to get their kids to school. They're trying to take care of their elderly parents. They're doing the things that most people do. And so the one thing I do, in a sense, respect about the presidential process, as expensive as it's become, is that retail aspect that's expected in those early primary states. There is criticism of which states there are currently, but I think it is inspiring when you see someone who's running for the most important elected official in the world sit there in a town hall of 50 people and have to explain himself or herself and have to go to state fairs and so on. That's probably healthy for the system, even though there's a lot of unhealthy parts of the presidential election season.
Let's talk for a moment about divided government. And you have seen this. We've all seen it at the federal level. We see what's happening right now. I mean, they're having golf games on Sunday because it's divided. You wouldn't have to have a golf game if everybody was on the same team, right?
Right.
But you've seen it at the local level. And we touched on this in an earlier show about sometimes at the state level, Democrats and Republicans can get together more often. But now in Washington, D.C., we have obviously a Republican House, a Democrats-controlled Senate, and the White House is controlled by President Obama. Who wins in that case, and who loses?
I think there's a lot of stall, and a lot of things just don't happen. I know some people say, well, a divided government is better, that sort of has checks and balances in it, and others say that it's a problem and holds things up. And I'm not sure what the right answer is, but if I'm just taking the example of what we've seen the past couple of Congresses, you see a lot of deadlock and things not getting done. And I think at this time in our country, we need things to get done and move along. And I think that the divided government sets us back a step and doesn't allow us to do that at the federal level.
Mm-hmm. I would say that it really comes down, in a sense, to the individual officials and elected officials. If people, regardless of their party, want to seek common ground, want to sit down and move the process forward and not just be partisan and ideological, then there will be progress, regardless of if it's divided government or unified government. I served 4 years in the legislature in the minority party in the legislature, but the Democratic Party controlled the governorship. So I saw divided government up close and personal, and I did see on many issues where the party labels were put aside, and it was, okay, how are we going to figure out how to fund our public schools? Public schools are important. There's, of course, maybe ideological diversity about what level of funding, but this is important, and we're going to have to compromise because we got to have those schools open. And so I think sometimes we focus too much on party and really not enough on the individual lawmakers and making sure that those people are people who seek to move the process forward rather than just to gum it up.
And you definitely see that at the state level. We see that in New Jersey now, right. With the budget that Governor Christie just passed.
Mm-hmm.
Well, and I think that I don't know that we're going to go back to the days of Ronald Reagan and Tip O'Neill hanging out after work.
Right.
I don't know if that's going to happen. And I think, Newt Gingrich certainly didn't hang out with Bill Clinton.
No.
Right.
And even though they were playing golf last week, I don't think Boehner and Obama
are going to be long.
And sometimes I don't know. I don't think the American people have changed, but politics has certainly changed. And in a sense, you almost don't want to be seen spending time with the enemy, and I think that's probably the biggest problem.
Well, what's interesting is that in Kansas, I didn't think it was unusual, but I've now come to realize that it is. At our committee hearings, we don't sit by party. And so when I served in the legislature, you actually just sat by a random order that the committee secretary drew, and you socialize actually in the evening. Very often, regardless of party, open to all legislators. And I spoke to a friend in the Ohio House, and he said, and I think he actually said he doesn't really even know someone across the aisle very well personally. Whereas I can, pull out my cell phone and show you many, cell phone numbers of Republicans in the legislature who I consider good friends.
Yeah.
A perfect example of that is the attorneys general. There are certainly organizations that help support the election of Republicans and Democrats, but when they all come together for their meetings, they sit alphabetically by state. And so if you were just sitting there in the room, you would not know with which party they were affiliated, and I think that's the way it should be. It helps them get the job done.
It's a good thing. Well, we've got to take a quick time out. We're going to talk about the 2012 elections that are coming up and get some of your thoughts on what's going to happen, because this is going to fill the news in a way that we've probably never seen before over the next year. We'll take a quick time out and be back right after this. Welcome back to the AAHOA Educational Experience. I'm Chip Rogers, and with me today is Lori Kalani, a senior counsel at Orick, Harrington, and Sutcliffe, and Raj Goyal, former state representative from Kansas. Thank you for being with us. Last segment of the show today, and we are going to talk quickly about the upcoming elections. If you tried to escape it and say, I don't want to hear anything about it, it would be impossible. So between now and November of 2012, this is really going to be a dominant part of the American culture. It's going to be what's discussed around the water cooler. So on that note, let's discuss it now. We were just talking in the break, at least as of today, 9 major Republican candidates. What does that mean? What does that tell us? There are 9 people that are trying to do this.
That means we're going to have a lot of awful long debates. I mean, it's very early on, but it dilutes the party. I wish that it weren't 9, and I think by the time it's over, it'll be 10 or maybe 11. And I wish that weren't the case. I wish there were a few that would rise to the top, and Americans could sort of make that decision with fewer choices.
Well, it's obviously, unless Dennis Kucinich or somebody like that runs, Barack Obama will not have any legitimate challenge on the Democrat side. So really, over the next few months, the discussion is going to be on the Republican side. We've talked about the 9 that extend from Ron Paul on one end to, I don't know who you'd put on the other end. I don't want to disparage anyone here, but I mean, you do have the assumed front runner in Mitt Romney.
Sure.
Raj, you've been involved in politics.
Yes.
And you can judge the other side. Who do you think is going to come out of this?
Well, I would say this about Lori's point about the number of candidates is that primaries can either be a very beneficial thing to a party in a presidential process or a negative thing. And so I think in 2008, most objective people would say that the primary process on the Democratic Party ended up being a healthy, beneficial thing. There were 3 major Democratic candidates out of about a half a dozen that filed, and then of course it came down to 2, and in the process all the under-the-radar things happened where operatives and campaign staff ended up working dozens of elections because there was state after state after state of these primaries, and so now of course the winds were blowing in the Democrats' direction in 2008, and so the general election turned out favorably for President Obama, but I do think that it's very early to say who's a front runner on the Republican side, what will happen. I will remind you that in, June of 2007, all the pundits would have told you it was obviously going to be Hillary Clinton and Rudy Giuliani in the general election, and we saw how that turned out. So,
well, you had John McCain driving himself because he'd run out of cash.
That's right.
And all his staff had quit, and he was way behind in the polls, and
Right.
he's the nominee.
And there were calls for him to pull out. And
Right.
remember, the same
Right.
thing happened to John Kerry in 2003 in the run up to the 2004 cycle. So I think it's very early, and as we've all talked about, there will be a winnowing process. And I think there's a common perception, and probably a very justified one, that in this weak economy, that President Obama is vulnerable to defeat. And so I'm not surprised that there's so many Republicans who want to test the water and get in and see if they can be the candidate.
You know, last time it seemed like, at least on the Republican side, the war was a dominant issue, and this time I think undoubtedly it's going to be the economy.
And
Does
jobs.
And jobs. Does
Right.
that favor anybody? Does somebody say, I am the jobs guy, and on the Republican side, and have some credibility in doing so?
I think if Rick Perry gets in, he can certainly say he's accounted for some large percentage of all the new jobs in the country. I'm sure that several others will also make the jobs claim, but I agree with you that I think jobs will be the dominant issue, at least for now. Who knows what happens tomorrow, and who knows what the news brings, in the next 6 months, but I think that now it will be jobs.
Mm-hmm. Will the Osama bin Laden factor play into this at all? Or did that happen in our 20-second mind now that we forget everything? Did that happen too early?
Well, obviously, we're all pleased it happened, that it just happened, and we wanted it done earlier. But I think we can all commend the special forces who made that happen on May 1st. I would say that in regards to who the issue template favors, again, I hate to say it, but it's too early to say. We don't know where the economy will be in the second quarter of 2012, and of course, the issues that seem to favor perhaps Mitt Romney on his business background may turn around, may come back to bite him from the information that we'll get from the other side and from media scrutiny and so on. So again, I think it's we're in this process now, and we'll have the candidates test their mettle out in the early states.
You mentioned it earlier about the process of going through those early states. You have Iowa, you have New Hampshire, you've got Nevada, you've got South Carolina, and each of these states very different in what type of candidate is going to perform well there. But one thing we haven't mentioned is the Tea Party influence on the Republican primary process. I think if you went back a couple of years ago when Rick Santelli made those famous words that have spawned kind of this movement on, that most people would have said, well, that's going to peter out and go away, and it hasn't. Lori, what do you think is going to be the impact? Will the Tea Party dictate who the Republican nominee is going to be?
Yeah, again, I think it's too early to tell. So much will depend on the way things go with the economy and national security. I mean, we never know what's around the corner. We hope nothing, but we just don't know what's in front of us. So I don't know. I heard years ago the same thing you heard a few years ago, which was that this will peter out and this is just sort of a fad, and that has not been the case. I think, in my own opinion, that it's sort of leveled out a little bit. Would you agree?
Well,
on the Tea Party?
Yeah, I mean, what I would say is that I definitely agree it's too early to say that the Tea Party will dictate the nominee. I think we could all agree that the Tea Party's influence will be significant in this nomination process. And I do think it's interesting that in the Republican Party process, many people have said, and I think they're probably right, that George H.W. Bush and Ronald Reagan would not be sufficiently conservative to emerge from where the Republican Party is right now in their nominating process, and where the policies and the principles and the ideologies are. So it's no doubt and objectively true that the Republican Party has moved to the right over the last 20 to 30 years, and so to the extent that the Tea Party has been involved in that, there's no doubt in its significant influence.
But there was no Tea Party, so to speak, because that term had been coined since the issue with the British. But
that small little issue.
That little issue with the British back in the late 70s. But it had that term had kind of died away until it popped back up here a few years ago. But you go back to 2008, and John McCain was probably considered. I wouldn't consider him right wing, and he made his way through that process, and it may have been because he was on one side and everybody else was on the other side. I don't know that we're going to see that this time with 9 candidates. I mean, if you look at Herman Cain, Ron Paul, Gary Johnson, Tim Pawlenty, Newt Gingrich, it seems like they've got every base covered.
The whole spectrum.
The whole spectrum has been covered.
Yes, the whole spectrum.
Is there? Both know this process. When do we get down to 1 and 2? Because it's eventually going to get there. I mean, I've heard people say this thing's going to go all the way to the convention. I just don't see that happening.
Well, I mean, of course, the first Iowa is in early January, and so it really, I think, depends on the nature of the outcome there. If there is a decisive winner or somebody who's unexpected, who vaults to the top or finishes in the top 3, I think you could see a more serious winnowing out process. And certainly, then Senator Obama used Iowa as the catapult to his momentum through the whole primary season, and then on February 5th, on Super Tuesday, when he fought Senator Clinton to a draw, he was in pole position from that point forward. I think it just really depends on the nature of the outcome in Iowa. If, for example, a Pawlenty performs badly, I think you could say that he's pretty much done because he's invested so much in Iowa. If Romney, for example, were to outperform expectations in Iowa and then win handily in New Hampshire, win in Nevada, he might be on a steamroller path to the nomination. So again, I think depends on what we'll see in the next 6 months.
But by Super Tuesday, I suspect you're going to be down to 1, 2, or 3 candidates, I would think.
Hopefully.
Yeah, I think that would be right. It would be hard to see it going past that, but you never know.
All right, I'm going to put you both on the spot here as we close out. I know you hate this, but we're sitting here in the summer of 2011. What are the chances that President Obama gets reelected?
I think Obama gets reelected.
I would agree.
100% chance?
No, there's no such thing.
Yeah, that's right.
No such thing.
But it will be a spirited, expensive,
yes,
lengthy process, and as messy as it is, as I think one person once said, it's the worst system, but it's the best system there is.
Right.
This political process is very ugly, but it usually gives us a result that I think reflects the wishes of the American people at that point in history. And so we're going to see that over the next few months. Well, listen, thank you both for spending some time with us today. I know that sometimes I ask you questions you may not want to answer, but you did a great job doing it. Lori Kalani, Senior Counsel with Oric, Harrington, Sutcliffe, and Raj Goyal, former state representative from Kansas and a great friend of AAHOA. Thank you both for being here today.
Thanks,
this is Chip Rogers saying so long for the AAHOA Educational Experience. If you have any questions, please send me an email, chip@AAHOA.com. That's chip@AAHOA.com, and we'll see you again next week.